Hello all, Rick here with the next part of the entire Star Trek timeline, technically part 3 after a more in-depth look at the fall of Iconia. We ended the last section around 200,000 years before the Earth Year 0. So picking up where we left off, let's start with something that is a little vague. It's probable that around this time the sphere creation encountered in 2257 begins its journey to observe and collect knowledge. But its origin is a mystery. Partially artificial, part alive, it could be either a probe or an entity that continued to evolve with time as it built up a library of knowledge. Travelling around, it observed many things, cataloguing knowledge on artificial intelligences, the histories of passing planets and peoples, including the history of Kaminar. The age estimate of the sphere started at around 100,000 years old, but as sifting through its information continues, that estimate is gradually going further back. Another sphere that probably came into existence around this time is the Jenolan Dyson Sphere, although this is only mentioned outside of the shows. Also, around this time, the planet of Talos 4, the first planet visited in the Star Trek series, suffers a world war which leaves the surface uninhabitable. The surviving natives retreat into underground bunkers and begin to build cities there, but the survivors may not have had the technological knowledge to maintain these underground cities, and over time, much of the technology they relied on began to decline. In response, the Talosians instead focused on developing their psionic powers, becoming incredibly powerful telepaths, and creating massive illusions that were real enough to pass and even feel real. Their society, however, would eventually begin to stagnate over the next 100,000 years or so, although some sources say that this war could have been much earlier in the timeline. The Preservers are very active all throughout this time period, and up until around 18,000 BC, many people suspect that these are the same species, or at least direct descendants, of the ancient humanoids. Remember them from part 1 of this series? In a way, continuing their mission to cultivate humanoid life as best they can, and to prevent the extinction of them. If not a direct link, then at least they shared a compatible goal. If so, then their footprints are all throughout galactic life, but eventually they faded from history too. To give some context, Preserver technology was found on Amarant, Andoria, and Magna Roma, and they may be responsible for further dissemination of humanoid forms, especially those early TOS aliens that looked exactly like humans. In the Delta Quadrant, an ocean planet is created when all the water of an M-class world is removed and artificially suspended in a force field, creating a water world held together by a core reactor. Also in the Delta Quadrant, at around 100,000 years ago, is an unknown species that utilised singularities, eventually creating a network of communications arrays across a very large area, suggesting that they had advanced spaceflight capabilities too. This species was gone by the time of Voyager's discovery of that network. Additionally, El-Orion hearsay has the Borg originate around this time period, but that's unlikely considering their rate of growth in later years. I thought I'd mention it just in case, however. At around 50,000 years ago, the Horta species, a sentient mineral lifeform, entered their incubation period on Janus 6, at a time when they all died out except for a single individual who maintains guardianship of the egg clutch and waits for them to hatch again. The planet, Cheron, was the subject of an uprising between its several indigenous races after the oppression of one side from another. Lukai led the revolution but was pursued by Beale for treason, where the two would engage in a game of cat and mouse for the next 50,000 years, while the planet itself was wiped out in an ensuing race war, leaving these two the only embittered survivors who continued their pointless struggle. The First Federation is supposedly founded at this time, although this is not mentioned on screen, so take that with a grain of salt. At the time, their territory did not reach the borders it would later establish, and aside from being a very advanced and powerful civilization, their claimed territory remained rather modest. At around 45,000 years ago, the sky spirits from the Delta Quadrant visited Earth and had a massive impact on what would become the Native American populace. At the time, These humans were nomadic hunters without a spoken language, although their respect for the land and life impressed the sky spirits, who influenced their genome to develop them further. We will come back to these people at a later date. Although, by around the 19th century, the descendants of the Sky People's influence, named the Inheritors, had spread over the land and developed their own customs, but eventually they were displaced by later human civilisations, becoming a small and scattered people who preserved their ancestral heritage as best they could into the 25th century and beyond. This was unknown to the Sky People, who failed to locate the Inheritors as they assumed they'd been wiped out, never visiting Earth again after this date. I'm mentioning this here in case I forget about coming back to them in a later video. On Earth, the Neanderthals collect their Darwin Award and go extinct around this time, but it's a gradual process and it's not like they all died out. After all, it's likely they ended up mingling with other early humans alongside failing to thrive by themselves. But around 30,000 years ago, the Verathans had expanded their interstellar imperial civilization over around 24 star systems, and created a robust trade and communications network in the Gamma Quadrant spanning 19 known dynasties. However, they would not last, and by the 24th century, they had gone extinct. Maybe the Dominion took out the last of them, who knows. On Bajor at this time, a power wraith known as Kosst Amojan and a prophet arrive on the planet, and they are sealed inside a stone tablet to prevent their reckoning. This tablet is then buried with an ancient Bajoran city which persists for 7,000 years and its events folded into mythology. Meanwhile, humans are learning how to do better civilization and stuff, with elements of deep-sea fishing, creating fibre-based clothing, making early sculptures and painting shells. And we have the last glacial maximum at around 26,000 years ago, with the surface of the planet being up to 25% ice at times. Tagus 3, remember that ancient planet I mentioned in the last part with a consistent 2 billion years of civilization? Well, they finally allow the first outsiders onto their world to conduct archaeological surveys at around 22,000 years ago. On Bajor, once more, the holy city of Valhalla is founded and persists for 2,000 years before becoming uninhabited and lost at this time. It's unlikely they had the orbs of the prophets yet, however their beliefs were already being shaped by the legends beforehand. On Trill, the first joining takes place. I'll leave it there because the exact nature of how the Trill came to be is the subject of Apocrypha, but it was either convergent evolution, an accident, or something I don't want to contemplate. The Kurlan people existed in this time, and relics of their spirituality continue to exist for many centuries, while the people of Sigma Draconis begin to expand their technology into an interstellar travel. However, this would not last for them, as their ice age reached intolerable levels, and they were forced to retreat underground, where their society developed, and while the women were sheltered underground, the men ended up staying on the surface, leading to a divide that lasted far longer than they anticipated. Additionally, there are species of spacefaring peoples who created a symbiotic bond with Gomtu's species, which they then used to explore the galaxy at faster-than-light speeds. Over the next 2,000 years, however, they would fall, eventually leaving only one known surviving vessel. We are now passing into an era of less than 10,000 years ago, and it's in this era we see the beginnings of one of the major powers of Star Trek's galaxy as we see it, although this is only based in a single line of dialogue and contradicted by other sources. It's possible that the Dominion, as a concept from the founders, began around 8,000 years ago. We also see several artificial intelligences get their emergence in this era, with the custodian of the planet Aldea being installed by the inhabitants to watch over them and maintain their culture for the next 10,000 years or so. Another computer was Val, the dictator supercomputer of Gamma Trianguli 6, however, its creators are unknown. And finally, the species known as the Fabrini lose their primary sun of the Fabrina system, and as such loaded a nearby asteroid with a reactor, computer and life support systems before riding it out of their system on a generational move to a colony world. In this epoch, we can see that numerous recognisable names and cultures are beginning to be mentioned, with most of the players that we know from Star Trek having their early roots in this period. Vulcans, Klingons, and of course humans are all pre-industrial and still evolving to reach something recognisable. Of course, this is far before most of them are aware of interstellar life, but big changes are happening across the board, such as Bajor beginning to be heavily influenced by the Prophets and form its identity, while most other planets are evolving into cultures. Humans were emerging as their competitor lines were being absorbed or wiped out, and the Vulcans were still twatting each other with rocks and sticks. You know, when viewed in this fashion, it's not surprising to see the Qs take on humans. Seriously, on their scale of time, they looked away for 1 second and suddenly the primates have spaceships. Meanwhile, the galaxy is host to its own powers and empires, much as before, and some of these will continue to exist into the Star Trek timeline, but most fading into more recent legend. It's about now that the timeline is going to slow down quite a bit, as observable history begins on numerous planets. Alongside the past 2 timeline videos, there is a collection of apocryphal additions that I could make to this time, which I have refrained from including simply because they could be rendered untrue, but we have several other empires rising and falling in this time. The chief idea being that there were 3 periods between 100,000 and 30,000 years ago, where next all interstellar travel is non-existent for a stretch of time. This is likely not due to any menacing thing, but simply points where the biggest powers on the block failed and a younger race had yet to emerge with warp drive. So, thanks for watching this next part in the entire timeline of Star Trek. I've been Rick, and I'll see you again for another video. Until then, goodbye.